Thanks everyone for being here. Today, I want to walk through a model that explains why execution often starts to feel less reliable as organizations grow. Even when the team is capable, the goals are still clear and everyone's still working hard. This is really about one question. What keeps execution from slowly breaking down as complexity increases? Because in most growing organizations, execution isn't one big dramatic moment as it fails. It softens, it drifts, it becomes less reliable one miss at a time. And what I want to do today is give you a practical model for understanding why that happens and what actually keeps it from happening. This is one of the most important ideas in the whole session. Execution rarely breaks in a way that feels obvious at first. It's usually not some sort of big collapse that everyone can point to immediately. It's way more subtle than that. It's a missed expectation here, a slight unclear handoff there, a delayed decision that doesn't seem serious in isolation, a question that should have surfaced earlier but didn't. Each one of those things feels small on its own, but the way organizations experience drift is cumulative. It's the accumulation of ambiguity. And by the time leaders say something feels off or execution isn't holding the way it used to, the erosion has often been underway for quite a while. Now, most leaders don't describe this as chaos at first. They describe it as heaviness. That's the word I hear most often because the company's still growing and the team looks capable. The people are often really committed, but the rhythm changes as it grows. Leaders end up repeating themselves more often. More issues rise to senior leaders than they used to, and meetings start producing way more discussion than clarity. People nod and say yes, and then the same problems continue to pop up. Decisions that used to move really quickly seem to stall, and escalations seem to compound. People start relying on the founder, the COO, or one particularly strong leader to keep things from slipping. That is usually the moment where the organization is feeling the gap between the informal coordination and the real operational structure. So what used to work through proximity, memory, and a few strong operators, it no longer scales cleanly. This is where most organizations make a very understandable mistake. They respond to this inconsistency by adding more visible structure, more reporting, more meetings, more dashboards, more checklists, more workflows, more planning. And to be clear, I'm not saying those things are wrong, right? Process matters, metrics matter, structure matters. But if the behavioral foundation underneath them is still informal, then more structure often makes the inconsistency more visible without actually fixing it. It's a bit like tightening the measurement system around a moving target. You might get better visibility, but not better reliability because the organization has still not clarified those standards that determine how people actually operate day to day. At LoyaltyOps, we look at consistent execution through three connected layers: people, process, and performance. People is the behavioral foundation. It's how the leaders and teams actually operate, how expectations are set, how accountability is reinforced, how disagreement is handled, how ownership is expressed. Process is the amplifier. It's how meetings run before, during, after, how decisions move, what types of decisions we make and when, how priorities are reinforced, and how work gets coordinated across teams and functions. Performance is the result over time, not one strong or weak quarter, but reliable execution across pressure, growth, and change. The reason this matters is that most execution problems aren't random. They're usually a result of misalignment across those three layers. So when they are reinforced, execution begins to stabilize. And when they drift apart, that friction compounds. This is probably one of the biggest mindset shifts inside the loyalty ops system because a lot of organizations still think that behavior is a soft side. It's a soft skill of performance that we can't really build structure around. In practice, it's the foundation because the people layer determines whether your standards, your cultural standards, your operating standards, the way people work together and in isolation, whether that's explicit or assumed. It determines whether accountability feels fair, just, transparent, or personal. It determines whether disagreement strengthens decisions, strengthens planning, or creates politics. It determines whether teams are coordinating from a shared operating standard or from individual interpretation and optimization. When words like ownership, integrity, accountability, or urgency are not defined behaviorally, different leaders apply different meanings to them naturally. And once that happens, inconsistency is built into your system. And this is why this layer matters so much. Behavior is not secondary to execution. It's the first condition that makes consistent execution possible. So let's make that concrete. Take a word like ownership. Most teams say we value ownership, but very few define it in a way that produces consistent behavior. So if ownership as a word just remains a general principle, right? People tend to escalate ambiguity upwards. They wait, they defer, they look for leadership to interpret the situation. But if ownership is defined behaviorally, for example, the person closest to the issue proposes the first solution. Now, the standard becomes much more actionable. Meetings change. Escalation often decreases. Responsibility becomes visible. The important point here is that the difference is not motivational. The team did not suddenly become more committed and feel more ownership. What changed is the standard became clearer. And once the standard becomes clearer, coordination becomes easier. Once the people layer is clear, process becomes really useful in the right way. Process is what turns behavioral standards into something the organization can reinforce repeatedly. It's how meetings produce decisions, how priorities get carried forward, how feedback moves, how commitments are followed up, how decision and ownership travel through that system. But process does not replace the people layer, it amplifies it. If the standard is clear, process will accelerate it. If the standard is vague, process tends to magnify confusion. A checklist is not going to create accountability if leaders model inconsistent behavior around commitments. A meeting cadence is not going to create alignment if the team still interprets key expectations differently. That is why process alone so often underdelivers, and it's often being asked to fix something it was never designed to fix. This is a good example because so many organizations have some version of this. A company installs a weekly accountability meeting, right? So many companies have these. The process sounds strong, right? There's an agenda, actions are reviewed, everyone's expected to report on progress, and on paper, that looks like accountability. But now imagine one leader takes commitment seriously, another treats them loosely, and the executive team tolerates the missed follow through without reinforcing a visible standard. So what happens there? The meeting doesn't create accountability. It just records inconsistently on Zoom, right? So the process exists, but it's amplifying a lack of shared behavioral standard instead of correcting it. And that's the danger of putting strong process on top of weak or uneven people standards. And when we say performance, we're not just talking about effort or output, right? We're talking about reliability. Can this organization produce results consistently as complexity increases? Can it hold standards across teams, managers, and changing conditions? Can it make decisions without consistent executive intervention? A lot of companies can produce intensity. They can push hard for a quarter. They can rely on a strong operator to pull things through. But that's not the same as reliability. Reliability is what allows an organization to grow without feeling like every next stage requires more heroics from leadership. And that is the real outcome this model is aimed at. One of the reasons this model matters is because it gives you a practical diagnostic lens, right? When execution feels inconsistent, the answer is not always more communication. It's not always more accountability. You need to know where the structural gap is. If you already have workflows and dashboards and documented processes, but execution still varies widely, the gap is often that people layer. The standard should make the process meaningful are actually too vague, too assumed, and unevenly reinforced. So if leaders and teams seem aligned in principle, but work still moves slowly, decisions keep stalling, or coordination feels clumsy, the gap is often process. And if both look clear on paper, but everything weakens under pressure, the gap there is usually leadership modeling. The last one is the lever that makes the rest of the system real. Leadership modeling is what we call our core lever because it determines whether any standard, any structure becomes real in practice. Teams learn what matters by watching leaders, not by reading the handbook, not by hearing the company values repeated in a meeting. They learn by watching what leaders do when pressure rises. Do leaders follow the same standard they ask others to follow? Do they reinforce clarity or increase ambiguity? Do they honor ownership or override it? Do they hold themselves accountable visibly? This is what the team will normalize. And over time, the behaviors that leaders repeatedly demonstrate become the real standards of the organization, regardless of what the playbook or formal standard says. Sometimes leadership modeling sounds abstract. So let's try and make this a little bit more concrete for you. It means that leaders clarify expectations before work begins, not after something goes wrong. It means they participate fully in the meeting disciplines they want others to follow. It means they own miscommitments publicly instead of protecting themselves with explanation. And it means they reinforce standards more visibly when the business is under strain, because that is exactly when teams are learning what is really negotiable. So leadership modeling isn't some symbolic perspective, right? It's a visible behavior that either legitimizes your standards or weaken them. A useful phrase kind of at this point here is one that I say pretty frequently. It's execution breaks at the point of exception. Imagine a company says it values disciplined meetings. Everyone should arrive prepared. Decisions named clearly. Owners should leave explicit. But then the executive team arrives late, changes direction informally, skips prep, or leaves decisions half made. At that point, the organization learns a much more powerful lesson than anything written on that agenda. The structure is optional when authority is involved. That is why exceptions matter so much. Every exception teaches the real standard faster than documenting ever will. And that's one of the main reasons good frameworks often erode after a promising start. So most organizations don't lack values. They've all got those posters on the wall, right? They don't lack meetings. We have more meetings than ever now these days. They don't lack dashboards. We have thousands. Frameworks are good intentions. What they often lack is the structure that keeps those things aligned over time. And this is why execution drifts. Standards soften, feedback gets filtered, ownership becomes more or informal, than leaders realize. Learning happens, but it doesn't become structural adjustment. Our flywheel that we're going to teach next exists to solve that problem. And it's not by adding theory or frameworks to your playbooks, right? It's about creating a disciplined loop that keeps your standards and structure connected under real operating conditions. This is the LoyaltyOps flywheel. It's 4 stages: communicate, collect, commit, and continuously improve. Simple. What matters here is it's a rhythm, right? It's not just a framework, it's a rhythm. Communicate creates that clarity and context before action begins. Collect verifies that it actually landed, they understand it, and what friction's surfacing from the ground. Commit turns ownership and decision authority into something explicit and reliable. And then continuously improve turns experience into structural adjustment and optimization. This loop is what keeps people and process connected under pressure. And without a loop like this, organizations tend to drift back to assumptions, interpretation, and founder dependence. So let's dig into each one of these stages briefly. The first stage is communicate. So this is where leaders make expectations, explicit before execution begins. This includes things like shared direction, behavioral standards, priorities, and the practical expectations that are going to help the team coordinate without guessing. The important distinction here is that communicating is not the same thing as saying more. It means making the standard specific enough that people can actually operate from it. And we all know communication isn't just verbal. It isn't just written, it's behavioral. I communicate through my body language, through my actions, through my modeling. So here's an example. We need stronger accountability. I've heard this 10,000 times. It sounds useful, right? It just does nothing. Saying every commitment leaves this meeting with one owner, one deadline, and one next step. Now that is concrete. Everyone understands it. It's clear. It's transparent. That is the purpose of communicate. It turns vague intent into something visible enough to reinforce, and it shows people through action what your expectations are. And so saying we need stronger accountability and not owning up to a mistake you made or to something you missed as a leader in front of your team, that's not communicating, right? A practical example here is at my company at LoyaltyOps, we have kind of a rule. We use loose language in the office, right around the house. My husband, who's our co-founder, is in the military, and so we curse, right? It is what it is. It's kind of our natural operating standard and language. It's always respectful. It's always, right? We have rules and regulations, but you're allowed to drop some light curse words in the office. But when we're client facing, that language is absolutely not allowed. We do not swear. We do not use cuss words when meeting with clients. It's just a rule. And we uphold that rule. But every once in a while, I will catch myself because I am who I am. And I will say something in a meeting and go, oh, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that. It came out. I apologize. And what I do is I hold myself accountable, but then I will check in with the team and say, hey, guys, I'm sure you noticed in that meeting, I dropped a curse word. It came out. I hold myself accountable. I shouldn't have done it. I know that I did it. My plan is to, not get so emotional in a meeting, tone myself down. I should have taken a breath and I didn't. I apologize to everyone. It wasn't appropriate. I apologize to the client. That right there is communicate, right? Not only did I set the standard, did everyone know the standard, but I actively verbally modeled holding myself accountable. The second stage of the flywheel is called collect. This is where leaders verify whether what they communicated actually landed in practice. right? We've all had those meetings where you say the thing, you give the plan, everyone nods, and then a week later you're in the meeting and no one understood what you were talking about, and they did a whole bunch of things that were not what you thought. One of the most common leadership errors is assuming that because what you said was clear, was that it was understood clearly. So collect is meant to close that gap. This is where we surface whether the standard was actually understood, whether people are applying it consistently, and where friction is showing up. This is where feedback becomes critical. And in reality, it can't travel upward early. Leaders end up managing some version of something that's not reality, right? So collect keeps the system honest. It's about collecting feedback, making sure and clarifying understanding. It's also a step where if you're going to make a change or do a thing, you get insight and real feedback from the ground before we move into execution, right? One of the things we see all the time in organizations, a great example of this is planning. Most organizations have no idea how to plan properly. And what will happen is senior leadership will come together and come up with a strategy and actually build the plan and then dictate it to the teams who execute and wonder why they didn't own it, why they didn't surface mistakes or challenges, why it didn't work. So you got no feedback, you got no insight, you got no planning from the people doing the work. That is collect. The third stage is commit. Okay, great. We've communicated what our intent is, what the expectations are, what we're going to do. We've modeled it. We got some feedback. We confirmed understanding. We have all the insights we need. Now it's time to commit. And this is where ownership becomes strong enough to hold without consistent executive intervention. So who owns the decision? What type of decision is it? Who asks next? What escalates and when, right? These sound so basic, but a huge, huge amount of organizations slow down. It comes from this ambiguity in this area. So a team can be smart and committed and hardworking and really take pride in the ownership of their work and still execute poorly if ownership remains fuzzy. And it's not just knowing I own the work, it's knowing I own the work. I understand the decision I need to make. I understand the guardrails around this decision, how to make a good decision, what good looks like, who, if I need to align, who I align with, and if I need to escalate, who do I escalate to? What information do they need? That's commit. Commit removes ambiguity. It actually turns accountability, that word we've said so many times, into something structural rather than personal. And that shift matters so much because people respond very differently when the standard is visible and ownership is explicit, as opposed to when the standard is assumed. The fourth and final stage of the flywheel is continuously improve. This is where the organization takes what happened in reality and uses it to strengthen the system itself. A lot of teams do some kind of reflection. They review what happened if it broke. They talk about what didn't work. They know what was frustrating. But far fewer teams actually translate that reflection into sharper standards, clearer ownership, stronger structure. And that is the difference between awareness and improvement. If nothing in the system changes, the same drift ends the return. It becomes a broken record. So continuously improve really means that the next cycle gets stronger because the organization adjusted something real. This is how learning compounds instead of just repeating. When the flywheel is active, the effects become very visible, and I will say very quickly. Meetings shorten because there's less interpretation in the room, and the prep and standards for before and after the meeting are clear. Feedback arrives sooner because people know where it goes and trust that it will actually surface a resolution. Escalation decreases because ownership and authority are clear, and execution becomes less dependent on memory and individuals and personality and proximity. That's the real shift. The organization moves from heroics and effort dependent execution to structurally supported execution. And that right there is what makes growth feel stable instead of fragile. But the flywheel works. I'm going to caveat this. The flywheel only works if leaders model it. That's it. That's the breaking point. If leaders don't define the standards clearly and they don't model them clearly, communicate weakens. If leaders react poorly to feedback, hide it, or don't surface it, collect weakens. If leaders bypass ownership when it becomes inconvenient or step in even though it's not something they own, commit weakens. And if leaders reflect on everyone else except themselves, improve weakens. So leadership modeling isn't separate from the flywheel. It's what makes the flywheel credible and actually spin. Without that credibility, this whole system just feels procedural. It's something the organization is trying to do. Once you have leadership modeling with that credibility, this becomes part of how the organization actually operates. So, as you think about your own organization, these are some questions I will leave you with. And I encourage you to really spend some time reflecting on them. Where is clarity too implicit? Where is feedback arriving later than it should? Where is ownership still dependent on a specific person instead of a visible structure? Where are leaders exempt from these standards where others aren't? And which stage of that flywheel feels weakest for you right now? Most leaders already know the answer once the question becomes clear enough. And usually that answer points directly to the next structural lever that needs to be strengthened. So, practical tip here. You're not going to be able to fix every part of this system all at once, right? We all know, I heard a great metaphor for this, where change is like a sponge. And if you try and pour so much water into the sponge, it has no room to actually hold it. It's just going to pour right through, right? So we need to understand the capacity our team has for change and actually make the change before lumping more things onto it. It creates a lot of activity, but not a lot of progress. So the better path here is to identify one meaningful structural gap. Strengthen that one part of the loop. Pilot it, model it, test it, reinforce it enough that it actually holds. This is why we do this work through focused 90-day sprints, right? One lever, one installation, one part of your operating structure, strengthened, visible enough to become real before jumping on to the next thing. That is how execution becomes more reliable over time, not through like broad transformational language. It's through that disciplined structural reinforcement. If this surfaced a part of the loop that feels weak inside your organization, this is usually the right next conversation. So we work with leadership teams to identify that specific structural gap, producing inconsistent execution, and help them install the framework that closes it. So if it will be useful to talk through where it might be sitting in your context, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation. I will share a link to book a conversation. You can check us out at loyaltyops.com, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you.